and welcome to episode 3 of Later Than You Think. My name is Jeff Sidarius, your host, and today we're going to talk about the Neo-Marxists, and they're important because they form the connection between the philosophy of Karl Marx and the woke movement that we see all around us today. So we're going to delve into that, and time permitting, we'll also hopefully get to talk about Gnosticism, which is the other main pillar, if you will, of the woke movement that tells us a lot about much of the things that we see taking place around us. But before I get into all that, I want to make a point that could very well be the single most important point that I will make in this podcast. The point is simply this: all of us, and I'm talking to Christian people, conservative people, even people who would not identify with either group, possibly Jewish people, others. We all, everyone who cares about Western civilization, okay, and all of the culture that goes along with that has developed over the last 500 years, to pick a time frame. Everyone who cares about that, we all need to learn to distinguish between two things that appear very similar, or are made to appear very similar today, but which in reality are totally different and radically different. What am I talking about? What I'm talking about is the woke movement today is making a very deliberate and concerted effort to pass itself off as part of the normal, ordinary discourse, if you will, that has taken place in this country for the past 300 years or so. But it's not. It's totally and radically different. And that means, because they are trying to fly under the radar, so to speak, that means the burden is on us to figure out, when we're talking to a person or a group, we need to understand and determine for ourselves whether they really are a part of that common political and social discourse that's taken place in this country for 300 years, or whether they're not. And it's not always easy to do that, but it's essential. And if we don't do it successfully, we will fail in any interaction that we're trying to have with one of those woke people for any reason. Okay? This is what military people mean when they say, know thine enemy. Okay? If you don't understand who your enemy is and how they think, you're never going to be successful in dealing with them. Same thing in a litigation context. Know your opponent. You have to get some idea of how your opponent thinks. If you're not, you're at a critical disadvantage, and you're probably not going to do very well. So, and it's true in almost any other kind of interaction too. I'm not trying to say that they're all, enemies and opponents. Whether you're just trying to befriend someone or trying to mend a relationship or whatever it is, someone who's, running for a school board position, let's say, it's the same issue. Okay, let me try to be specific about what I mean here. What I'm talking about is there is a tradition in this country that we all understand. Certainly if we're over the age of, say, 35, we understand it. And that tradition it's what I call the classic Western liberal tradition. Now, immediately I have to explain what I mean by liberal, because that word has been distorted and bent out of shape, and today it's virtually meaningless. But what I mean by liberal in this context is the classic broad definition, which would apply to both Western thinkers that we would consider to be conservative, like Edmund Burke, let's say, to pick up an example, or the founding fathers, let's say. And it would also apply to folks that we would consider to be more liberal, or perhaps capital D Democrat in American political terms. People like Thomas Jefferson, people like John F. Kennedy, and I could give you other examples as well. Liberal, I'm using in the way that Voltaire meant when he said famously, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means, it assumes that we have free, open debate, which all of the participants use constructively to advance the goal of creating a better world. That's the classic Western liberal tradition. On the other hand, we have the woke movement, which is the modern version or modern manifestation, if you will, of the school of thought that begins with Marx and Hegel, comes through the Neo-Marxists, who we're going to talk about today, and continues on into today's woke movement, and you can draw a direct line to that effect. These people do not accept the Western classic liberal tradition. In fact, it's not just that they oppose it, they want to destroy it. And that is why the onus is on us to understand when we're dealing with someone who's woke, and understanding that they want to subvert, infiltrate, and destroy the Western tradition, and with it, all of the other achievements of Western civilization. You think I'm exaggerating? I'm going to show you that that is not an exaggeration. They want to burn it to the ground because they believe it's evil, and because they believe, as Marx did, that revolution is the only way of bringing about heaven on earth. And so the sooner that revolution takes place, the better. So we better get on with it right now. And anyone who stands in the way, whether that be the church, whether that be a political party, whether that be conservatives, whether that be you or me or a business or any other kind of an organization, has to be destroyed, canceled, or transformed from within. It's imperative that we understand this. And if we don't understand anything and I'm talking to myself too, because I had to learn this the hard way through difficult personal experience, and I'm still learning it. But I'm telling you, we have to understand this, or our efforts, whether they are one-on-one efforts, whether they are witnessing efforts as Christians, whether they are political efforts as groups or organizations, whether that's at the local level, at the national level, it doesn't matter. Those efforts are virtually guaranteed to fail if we do not understand this one thing. The woke movement is trying to fly under the radar and pass itself off as part of the Western classic liberal tradition, and B, at the same time, is trying to undermine, infiltrate, and destroy the civilization and all of the societal structures that make Western civilization possible. And if you don't believe that, keep listening, and I will show you that this is in fact the case using their own words. So the next question you may be asking yourself is, how do I know? How do I know when I'm dealing with a person who's woke, given that they're trying to fly under the radar? Well, that's a great question, and we're going to come back to that question periodically throughout this podcast. Let me say two quick things about that now. Number one important way to tell is language. What words do they use? There are certain key words that woke people tend to use. One is if they talk about racism a lot and use the term systemic racism, that's an important indicator. Now listen, I'm not saying that everyone who's concerned about racism in this country is woke. I'm not saying that. You can be concerned, as millions of Americans are, with the topic of racism, but not be woke. What you're looking for is a kind of a obsession with, or undue focus on the subject of how the society is racist. That's obviously one way that you can have an indication. And another way is, do they believe, and can you see by their actions that they believe in the Golden Rule? Western civilization for hundreds of years, and even going back to the time of Christ, Jesus, yes, did teach this: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If they don't believe in that, and they don't show it, if they're not willing to abide by that principle in their dealings with you, that's a very important indication that they don't subscribe to that Western classical liberal tradition that we've been talking about. Marxists don't believe that. We've talked about that already in this pod. To them, the end justifies the means. So, and this is something that one of the Neo-Marxists, one of the primary Neo-Marxists, Herbert Marcuse, taught explicitly. It's fine to have a double standard for these folks. It's perfectly okay to trash conservatives and so-called right-wingers and censor them in social media, while at the same time allowing the most outrageous things to be said and done, as long as they come from people on the other side. And another tell, to go back to my first point about key words, is one of them, and we'll talk about others as we go along, but one of the key words is critical. I hope that at least some of you all know this already, but if you don't, I want to be the first to tell you that the word critical to a woke person does not mean the same thing as it does to those of us who are part of the classic Western liberal tradition. Not at all, not even close. You see, to us, that word has a positive connotation. We criticize ideas, not people. We criticize ideas because we hope to improve them. We believe that the open process of political free speech and open debate and the clash of ideas, if you will ultimately result in better ideas, more useful ideas, and move society and move life forward. That's what we have always believed. But, my dear friends, the woke do not believe this. And they use the word critical in a very different sense. When they use the word critical, they mean criticize it for the purpose of deconstructing it and ultimately tearing it down. And they apply that word not to themselves, or rarely, I should say, to themselves, but almost 100% of the time, they apply that word to all of the Western civilization structures of society, politics, religion, culture, and so forth that they wish to tear down. So that's not a complete discussion, but at least it will hopefully give you a flavor of the point that I'm trying to make here and the kind of mental shift that we all, including myself, need to make in order to function successfully in this new world into which, by the way, we've all been thrust. We didn't ask for any of this. this came out of the academic world of 30 and 40 and 50 years ago. And for most of us, myself included, we didn't even have any idea what the woke movement was or what it believed until the George Floyd riots in 2020. And then it's like, okay, something's going on here. We need to understand something different is happening, and we need to understand what it is. And some of us are still trying to figure it out. And it, like I said, it's been a long, difficult process for me to even get anywhere in figuring this out. But again, this is the task of our time and the hour that we've been placed in, and we have to get this right. And while we're on the subject of academia, I know I'm going to get to Neo-Gnosticism or Neo-Marxism, in a minute. But while we're on the subject of academia, I cannot resist making another observation. With regard to critical race theory, okay, there's many critical theories. I understand that. We're going to hit on them eventually. But critical race theory really began in 1989 in a paper published by a Harvard Law School professor named Derek Bell. Now, I can't resist making the point, where were the adults in the room when this happened? I mean, it's 1989. Harvard University is the premier academic institution, the crown jewel, if you will, of American academia. And here comes a guy arguing that all of American society is systemically racist. Now, wait, let's just stop. Let's just time out on the field for a second, okay? It's 1989. Derek Bell comes forward with this. Where were the adults in the room? Why didn't somebody stand up in the Harvard faculty? I'm talking about the Harvard Law School faculty. Why didn't someone stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, Dr. Bell, you have no evidence for this. You have no empirical evidence whatsoever. Sit down. We're not going to listen to you. We're not going to give you a seat at the table academically in this institution until you can come to us with valid empirical evidence that can be duplicated to support your claim. Apparently, that didn't happen. It should have happened. But because it did not happen and hasn't happened since, at least to the extent necessary to expose this movement for what it is, here we are today, and we must stand up. We must resist. We have to first recognize what this is. Secondly, we have to resist it. We have to reject it openly. And we have to say, sorry, you're outside of the bounds of civilized discussion, and you cannot have a seat at the table. Or to put it in Christian terms, these folks are adhering to a false religion, and yes, this has all the earmarks of a false religion. It's heretical, and therefore you and your followers may not have a seat at the table, so to speak. We're not going to adopt your tools. We're not going to have any part of this, and we reject it. And again, this is personal for me because my own denomination that I belong to, which is the Presbyterian Church in America, is now in the process of dealing with this. All right, with that said, let's return to the subject of the Neo-Marxists, and I'm going to add to that the Frankfurt School, which you may have heard about. Marx dies and meets his maker in the year 1883. Continuing forward from there and leading up to the First World War, as we talked about before, modernism was the dominant philosophy. We have the technology. We're rational beings. We can create the world we need to create. We don't need God. It's all good. The problem for Marx, however, and his followers at the time of his death and for the decades that followed was that the revolutions that Marx predicted, and he did predict them and wanted them to come about, the violent, bloody revolutions where the proletariat overthrew the bourgeoisie, he predicted that they would happen throughout the world. They didn't. And up until the Russian Revolution in 1917, there was very little by way of success in terms of Marxist theories, the way he predicted things would happen and unfold in history through the process of dialectical materialism, which we don't need to get into in great detail. The point is that in the Western democracies, Marx's philosophy simply was not catching on. It was not doing what he predicted it would do. And so that is a problem. And the problem really was not cured by the Russian Revolution in 1917. If it had not been for the Russian Revolution, I think it's fair to say, and others have said this, it's not original with me, if the Russian Revolution had not taken place in 1917, it's quite likely that Marxism would have been relegated to the dustbin of history where it belongs, quite frankly. But the Russian Revolution at least held out a little bit of hope. Nonetheless, the fact remained that outside of Russia, the Western democracies were not behaving the way Marx predicted they would behave. And this was a problem for those who held to Marxist philosophy. So that's what gets us to, if you will, the Neo-Marxist movement, which really starts in the 1930s. A number of people gathered together in what is called the Frankfurt School. These people include Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, who we're going to talk about most of all, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm. There were others. They came together and tried to come up with a way to resuscitate Marxism and make it relevant and make it successful. And here's what they came up with. They came up with what came to be known as cultural Marxism. Here's the bottom line. Marx predicted that the struggle, the class struggle between economic classes, the proletariat, the working class on the one hand, versus the bourgeoisie, the ownership class on the other hand, is what would drive revolution and ultimate change in society to bring about utopia. The cultural Marxists came in and said, well, this isn't working very well. The middle class are confounding this process because the middle class is happy. They're doing well, particularly in the United States. They're succeeding, and by and large, blips, economic blips and so forth notwithstanding, they're doing pretty well. They don't have that revolutionary fervor that is necessary to bring about the class struggle, which will bring about the revolution. So we've got to look for something else. What is that something else? Well, it's a revolution in a different form. It is a cultural revolution. So now you have people like Theodor Adorno and Antonio Gramsci, another important factor in this neo-Marxist equation, teaching that what there needs to be is a long march through the institutions, meaning the cultural institutions. That's how we'll do the revolution. We won't necessarily have to do a bloody, violent, armed revolution. We can get to the same result by taking over these institutions. And of course, they realized that that was going to be a process and it was going to take many decades. But the way to go would be to infiltrate those institutions and basically, to make a long story short, corrupt them. What institutions? Well, basically all of them. The media, academia, higher education, as well as lower education, religion, the arts, all of them. were fair game for this revolutionary process. Now, under the Neo-Marxists, the vehicle, if you will, for revolutionary change is not the worker, but now it's the oppressed minorities, or, if you like, oppressed identity groups. So the worker was not very good at bringing about revolution because the worker could change his economic circumstances. Particularly in the West, in America especially, he or she could better themselves, become members of the prosperous middle class, and even sometimes move into the upper class. So they are not very good at bringing about that revolution, but someone's race or someone's sex, they can't change those things. So we'll focus on those characteristics and see if we can't make those the vehicle of revolutionary energy, if you will. If we can get them to identify as members of that minority group or identity group and show them how oppressed they are, then they'll have the necessary resentment to bring about the revolution. So now the revolutionary dynamic is changed. Now it's about culture oppressing minority or identity groups, and based on racism, sexism, sexual normativity, etc. That's the driver now, not economic class struggle. But what's really important to see here is that these identity groups, which primarily were based on race and gender, those are the two main ones. Those identity groups they're the tools, if you will, that the Neo-Marxists wanted to use to leverage resentment in society, which that sort of revolutionary energy that they needed. Now, I'm probably belaboring this point somewhat, but to put it in a slightly different way, Marxist conflict theory was based on economic class conflict. Now, in the Neo-Marxist Frankfurt school, conflict theory is now based on oppressor groups versus oppressed groups, which are seen as victims and who are used to undermine the centers of culture. And you might ask, how was this to be accomplished? And the answer that arose out of the Neo-Marxists and the Frankfurt School was unrelenting criticism. And this is where we have birthed the idea of critical theory. And critical, as I mentioned before, in the sense of we're going to unrelentingly criticize and therefore tear down certain oppressor groups, so-called, society itself, if necessary, identities such as race, gender, and so forth. All of it is essentially everything, anything and everything that stands in the way of the long march through the institutions, which brings about the revolution that Marx and his followers have longed for. And I also want to mention the anti-God philosophy of Karl Marx did not take a sabbatical either. Max Horkheimer, who was director of the Frankfurt School beginning in 1930, believed and stated that the major obstacle to Marxism, in his view, was the Judeo-Christian heritage of Western culture. So we still, Marx's hatred of Christianity was still in full effect. And lest there be any doubt, here's a quote from Antonio Gramsci, another one of the Neo-Marxists, quote, "Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity," end quote. Now, before I discuss how critical theory as it was conceived by the Neo-Marxists works in practice, I want to read you a summary that James Lindsay has written of how the Neo-Marxists distinguished critical theory from traditional theory, which I think will be helpful in helping us understand what's going on here. Here's Lindsay's quote of Max Horkheimer's article, 1937, titled Traditional and Critical Theory. Lindsay summarizes it, and I'll put a link in the show notes. Quote, whereas a traditional theory is meant to be descriptive of some phenomenon, usually social, and aims to understand how it works and why it works that way, a critical theory should proceed from a prescriptive, normative, moral version for society. In other words, what he's saying is critical theory isn't even concerned with what is and how it got to be that way. It's only concerned about what it thinks should be the case. So critical theory proceeds from a prescriptive, normative, moral vision for society. It describes how the item being critiqued fails that vision, usually in a systemic sense, and prescribes activism to subvert, dismantle, disrupt, overthrow, or change it. That is, generally, to break and then remake society in accordance with the particular critical theory's prescribed vision. This use of the word critical is drawn from Marx's insistence that everything be ruthlessly criticized and from his admonition that the point of studying society is to change it. End quote. That is from James Lindsay's translations from the Wokish on his New Discourses website. So, how does one carry out or put into practice critical theory in real life? Well, first of all, according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it follows from Horkheimer's definition of critical theory that it must do three things. It must be explanatory, practical, and normative all at the same time. That is, it must explain what is wrong with current social reality, identify the actors who change it, who can change it, and provide both clear norms for criticism and achievable practical goals for social transformation. That's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy definition of critical theory. In reality, what this means is, and this is a very important term to understanding critical theory, both in the Neo-Marxist school and today, that is, to get this done, we have to problematize. This is a term that you may not be familiar with, but if you are not, you need to become familiar with it. I'm going to read to you from the definition in James Lindsay's New Discourses commentary for the word problematizing. Quote, to problematize something is to look for, identify, manufacture, and or expose the problematics in it or associated with it. Problematics are ways in which whatever it is you're looking at, and I'm paraphrasing here, whatever it be, a phenomenon, a entity, a business, a racial group, a person, a church, a social organization, or anything else, how that fails or falls short of the moral agenda that necessarily lies at the heart of the critical theory that is examining it. And by that, what Mr. Lindsay means as anything that is oppressive. So in other words, because critical theory is looking at everything through the lens of power, I'm going to continue on reading, of particular interest are ways in which those things might marginalize, exclude, minoritize, harm, cause oppression, or maintain or legitimate dominance or injustice through the machinations of systemic power. So what does this mean in real life? What it means is problematizing involves looking for oppression until you find it, which is, as you might suspect, basically assuming the result that you want to get to and then looking around for any old thing that'll substantiate your pre-existing belief. So continuing with Lindsay's definition, quote, put otherwise, problematics are what critical theories criticize, and problematizing is how it does its criticism. The goal of this activity is to replace false consciousness with critical consciousness, and thus agitate for a social and cultural revolution, end quote. So basically what we're saying here is that people are living in a fantasy world. They don't know they're being oppressed, and until they're subjected to critical theory and problematizing, they don't know the true nature of the reality that they're living in, and so it has to be exposed and brought to light. And that's the whole point of critical theory and problematizing. As Lindsay points out, it is really not an overstatement to say that those neo-Marxists and their successors in the woke movement actually see problematizing as their primary means of finding truth. In other words, deciding whether something is a true piece of knowledge or it's authentic. So the neo-Marxists would actually like to throw out the scientific principle of falsifiability as the test of knowing what is authentically true and really do away with it completely. As the physicist Richard Feynman remarked, this is the scientific, traditional Western view. It doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. The neo-Marxists, by contrast, would throw all of that out the window. Now, we're already going much longer with this episode than I intended to, and I want to stress at this point that my intention here is not to provide a comprehensive history of philosophy. I am not teaching a graduate level course in philosophy here, or an undergraduate, or any level of course in philosophy. I'm simply trying to draw the lines, if you will, from these philosophical schools to where we are today with the woke movement, and we've covered an important part of this. The one thing I do want to add before we end today's episode is you can see, both looking backward, how the neo-Marxists incorporate a great deal of Marx's original thinking, and I think in the recent discussion of problematizing, you can at least begin to see how the element of postmodern thinking is starting to creep into the analysis here. The fact of the matter is that when doing the exercise of problematizing, there is no objective knowledge necessary. And in fact, when you get to the postmodernists, which I hope to do in the next episode, we will see that this very distorted and stilted way of looking at the world does away with any need to provide empirical evidence and does away with any pretense of objective truth. So, although we did not, unfortunately, get to postmodernism or Gnosticism today, we will hopefully get to them in the very next episode. So thank you for listening. I want to leave you with two quotes, one from James Lindsay. It's still the goal to get to communism by making people hate the life that they live, hate the society that they live in, and try to become a revolutionary force, end quote. Very good summary of what's going on with both Marx and Neo-Marxism. And secondly, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great writer, Nobel Prize winner of a few decades ago, quote, "The truth eludes us if we do not concentrate with total attention to its pursuit." I'd welcome any feedback. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or you can email me at diggingfordiamonds99@gmail.com. That is diggingfordiamonds99@gmail.com.